Welcome back to the Retire in BC podcast. Today we're going to dive into all things mortgages, from the basics for first-time home buyers to smart strategies later in life. We're going to talk about how to shop, save, and make your mortgage work for you, no matter what stage of life you're in. Now, I don't know where you're at, but I know when I first started out, before I was in this industry, I remember shortly after we got married, I didn't know what a mortgage was. I didn't understand what it meant. And so, let's maybe just start with that just in real simple terms. If you don't know, there's no shame in that because I didn't know. And it's just a debt that's using a home as collateral. It's as simple as that. A mortgage is like your car loan or um, or I guess even like your Visa bill, although hopefully you're paying that off in its entirety. But a mortgage is just a loan. But what differentiates it from another loan, a car loan might have a lien against your car. A debt to the bank might not have any collateral or security at all, but a mortgage has your house as collateral. So if you miss a payment, they could take your house, sell it. And Actually, one common misconception people have is the bank, if they take your house and sell it, they don't get all the money. They sell it for what they sell it for, but they do get all of what they've lent you back first. They are the first creditor, and you get back what's left over. Um, that's what a
Yeah,
mortgage is.
yeah. Well, excited to talk about it. It's pretty topical right now because actually, I personally am going through this process at the moment. I'm currently, as we speak, shopping for a first home and shopping for a first mortgage. So I thought this one was timely, at least for us. And yeah, excited to chat about it. And I actually wanted to circle back to what you said just about at some point. Everybody's starting from nothing. We all have to learn this at some point. And so even if you're not sure what these are, A, that's what we're here for, is to be educational on this podcast and tell you all these topics. But B, like there's absolutely no shame in not knowing some of these topics.
Exactly.
There's this comic sometimes that I see online. It's called XKCD. They're not always like funny comics. Sometimes they're sort of slice of life things. And they were just pointing out that like everything that is at this point common knowledge, I believe this was looking at just the population based in the US, and everyone has to learn that at some point in their life. And they pointed out that every day, 10,000 people are learning this new thing that is common knowledge. And so the point of the comic was be one of those 10,000 people learning this, whatever it is. And let's not try to shame people for not knowing the basics.
I
So
heard this great line a while ago, common sense isn't all that common. And it's true. Like we don't know what common sense is. It's common sense is different to different people, right? Anyhow, yeah, that's right.
there you go.
So
So yeah, I mean, the other thing too is I think this is a perfect example of a topic that we can look at kind of from different generations here, right? I'm coming into it a little bit more fresh, excited to look at my first mortgage. Arnold's done this before a few times. Like I said, from a different generation and might have a different viewpoint or different strategies that might be more applicable to someone from his cohort than from mine.
no, that's a good point, Ben. I have done it a bunch of times, and in fact, I'd say in some areas I was sort of on the forefront. I'm not a mortgage broker. I don't know as much about a mortgage broker about mortgages as a mortgage broker does, but almost because I've done it so many times and I've researched so much stuff. So we'll definitely fill you in on all of that. Maybe we should just start with some basic terms and definitions. Do you want to
For
dive into
sure.
that, Ben?
Yeah, well, and you've already touched on the simple definition. All a mortgage is, you know what, you're trying to buy this asset, this home. Typically speaking, you can't afford to pay for that outright. Or at least you either can't afford to or you may not want to. You may want to be deploying your capital in some other way. You would like to have the bank finance it. You'd like to borrow so that you can reach beyond what you'd be comfortable with just spending on your cash in hand. So basically, you go to the bank or you go to some online mortgage lender and you say to them, hey, would you lend me the money so I can buy the house? What happens when you borrow money? Well, they're going to charge you interest, right? And so when you're doing that, you're going to qualify for some certain amount. You're going to have to pay back a certain amount of mortgage payment. Typically speaking, a fair portion of that, at least at the beginning, is going to be going towards that interest component. And only a tiny little bit of what your monthly payment is actually going towards that principal, or the principal just meaning the main balance that you still owe on the mortgage, right? Typically, then in Canada, most people are going to take a 25 or 30-year amortization, just meaning that's how long they're paying the loan off. And I just want to make a distinguish here between the amortization, which is how long the actual loan is in place for. And even that, like after your term is up, you can often change that if you want. But there's amortization and there's the actual term of the mortgage, which in Canada is typically shorter. Most often you take a 3-year or a 5-year term, just meaning your loan with that lender, that agreement is good for that term. Oftentimes, if you're taking a 5-year fixed term mortgage, that doesn't mean you're paying off the whole mortgage in 5 years. It just means your payment is fixed for the next 5 years. You know what to expect. And then at the end of that period, or in between if you'd like, and if it's flexible enough, you're renegotiating that and getting a new agreement in place.
So, bit of history here, actually. So, not me, but my dad had a 25-year term, 25-year amortization, 25-year term mortgage. Um, I don't believe those exist in Canada anymore. I think I've seen some 10-year terms, but it did used to be the case that you could actually have a fixed term for the entire mortgage. And so my dad, for example, knew that he was going to pay this exact same amount for 25 years. These days, more lenders just don't want to take that risk on, and so they typically don't offer terms longer than 5 years. Again, I think they were offering some that were as long as 10, but that's very uncommon. Um,
Well, and
the
that is typically how it works in the States,
yeah,
actually, is that you got a 25-year amortization and your term is the same 25 years. And, that's on the one hand good, on the one hand maybe
right,
bad. If anyone's watched the movie Big Short, well, one of the reasons they can do that, they just have much more depth in the mortgage. The banks can package up those mortgages and sell mortgage-backed securities to a pension plan or whatever they send
right.
it to. And just because their capital markets are so much deeper, I believe there's also some government support that gets brought in there that makes it more feasible for an American bank to offer a 25-year term. In our market, it's a little bit trickier for the banks to do that.
Well, they get to write off their mortgage interest as well, and we don't. One other thing that I do want to make sure we point out with the terms, technically, at the end of that term, you owe the full amount of the mortgage. Technically, legally, you're paying off a tiny little bit on this $500,000 mortgage. And in year 5, when your term is up, you owe whatever is left, $475,000. It's almost unheard of for banks not to renew. But if you remember in 2008, 2009, we actually did have, none of the big banks did this, but there were some small lenders that didn't have the capacity to renew. And there were a few people that got caught with that. They couldn't get renewals. And I'm certain, I didn't see any personal situations like this, but I'm certain that some of them may not have been able to get lending at any of the big banks and had to give up their home because of it. So very, very tiny risk, but it is something to be aware of. Legally, at the end of that term, all bets are off, right?
Yeah, the
So
bank isn't obligated to
that's
renew your
that's
mortgage.
right. But
Yeah.
that's again virtually unheard of. All the big banks, they continue to renew things when even during 2008.
Yeah, for sure. So on that note, too, or just going back to those term mortgages, we already used the term fixed rate. Typically speaking, and this is one of the decisions you're going to have to make when you're chatting about mortgages, is do you go fixed or floating? Really, all that means is that there are interest rates thrown at you, different numbers. Um, Generally speaking, if you take a fixed rate, That's just referring to the interest rate that they charge you for taking on the loan. A fixed rate is going to stay stable throughout the length of your term, whether it's 3 years or 5 years. I would tend to probably recommend a fixed rate, or well, not recommend because I'm not a mortgage broker, but think about those for people who would have trouble if the interest rate went up, right? If you're on a tight budget and you really couldn't handle an increase in your mortgage payments, fixed might be the way to go. A floating rate, typically it's going to follow what the Bank of Canada interest rate does. What's happening is there's an interest rate in the bank in the background that the Bank of Canada is charging to the banks for them to borrow. The bank is calculating their own prime rate, and then you're getting the bank's prime rate plus or minus some percentage. And so it just means that over time, over the length of your mortgage, the interest rate that you're paying may change, right? So you might get in at 4%, and then 6 months later, your interest rate might be 3.75, or it might be more. It might be 4.25, right?
Actually, one of the most common questions that I get asked is, hey, my mortgage is renewing next, in a month. Should I go short or long or floating or fixed? And, I strongly encourage everybody to look at, so when you typically, if you get a 1 year term, I'm going to differentiate a little bit here. Rather than fixed versus floating, I'm going to talk about a short-term fixed and a long-term fixed. Typically, when you get a 1 year term, usually the interest rate on that is a little bit cheaper than on a 5 year term. Same thing as when you go and you get a GIC or a term deposit at the bank. There's some exceptions to that when we have what's called an inverted yield curve, but most of the time, when you go to the bank to buy a GIC or to get a mortgage, on a 1 year, the interest rate, whether you're paying it or receiving it, is less than on a 5 year. And so historically, if you've gone to the bank and gotten 25 1 year terms. So you've got a 25-year mortgage and every year you're renewing it. Historically, you've actually saved a bit of money. You've paid less than 5 year terms. And I encourage people to look at that and to say, okay, can I afford, if I get a 1 year term, can I afford for my payments to jump up to double or even triple a year from today? And if you can't, then you want to go longer. So think of that differential in the price as an insurance premium. You're paying insurance to make sure that your payment doesn't go up. And so it's a real cost, but it can be very worth it because we have seen lots of situations where interest rates go up by not that much and your payments jump up dramatically.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. So moving on, then we'll kind of take a look at how to shop for a mortgage. And I think we wanted to define some of those terms first, because realistically, before you're even looking at shopping for a mortgage, you might want to determine for yourself what features are important to you in that mortgage so that you're more informed when you're going into it. Things like, would you prefer a fixed or a floating rate? Are you just doing a basic kind of first home kind of thing, or is this refinancing your existing home with a reverse mortgage or with a home equity line of credit? How much do you want to put down on the mortgage? So actually, that's something we haven't talked about yet, is the down payment. But typically speaking, for most homes, you need at minimum 5%. More often, people are recommending 20% down on a payment, down payment on a mortgage. That's a little bit tricky to do, especially in BC here where homes cost so much. But it wasn't on our to-do list here, but one of the reasons why you want to ideally get to 20% or beyond is that at that point, you don't have to pay the CMHC, which is the mortgage insurance. That's something that protects the bank, kind of not you, but it is if you have less than 20% down, something that you have to pay. That's actually a literal insurance premium that
Yeah, and you don't have a
just gets
choice on it.
stacked on, and you
Yeah,
don't
you
have a
don't have a
choice.
choice. Yeah. Yeah. Actually, Ben, I realized there's actually one other term that's not very well understood. that we should touch on. And oftentimes people don't even clue into this because it's kind of embedded inside the legalese documents. But when you look at the interest rate that you're paying on a mortgage, you'll see language along the lines of semi-annual not in advance, or compounded semi-annually not in advance. And what the net effect of that is if you have, well, let's just say you have a line of credit that you're paying 5% on, that's compounding every single month, right? So if you have 100 grand, um, that basically they take how many ever days and calculate what the 5% would be for those days, and they add that onto what you owe. And then the next month you owe again that many number of days at 5%, but also on the interest. So the interest is compounding every month. With a mortgage, the effective interest rate is actually a little bit less. So because it's compounding less frequently. And so sometimes when you see sort of that um, line of credit rate at 5% and you see a mortgage rate at 5%, the mortgage rate is actually less. I don't have the math here in front of me, but it'll be similar to a 4.9% equivalent kind of thing. And so it just, you know, they're small numbers, but they do add up when you're looking at 25 to 30 years, just something to be
Yeah,
aware of.
for sure. Well, and on that note too of small things adding up, one thing I wanted to highlight here is just that in the Western world, most of the things that we do, like it's not really a negotiable thing. When I walk to Starbucks and I buy a coffee, I'm not haggling over the price of the coffee. You know what I mean? But when it comes to bigger ticket items like a home, like a car, things like that, that's where that does kind of break down a little. Not only when you're buying the house, obviously you're making offers back and forth to try to change the purchasing price that you're getting, but also on the mortgage, you don't really want to just go out there and take the first mortgage rate that's offered to you. These are things that are negotiable. Not only can you shop around to different lenders, you can kind of play them off one another. Hey, I got 3.9 at this bank. What can you do for me over here? So
Yeah,
that's
no,
something where,
absolutely. It is the Wild West. It really is. I every time I've had mortgages renewing, I have gone to my banker and I have said, "Hey, look, here's all the rates I can get. I need you to do better," and push them and push them and push them, because 1/100th of a percent on a big amount makes a big difference. And actually, there's one other thing I want to mention. Ben had just talked about some of the features you want to think about you want. There is a favorite feature that I have. Now, this isn't right for everybody, but I do want to just touch on it because it's not one that's very well understood. Um, Maybe third 30 years ago, 25 years ago, um, they never had these. And then all of a sudden, this thing called a re-advanceable mortgage was developed. And it's weird terminology, so they don't use that anymore. Today, different banks, almost every bank has a version of a re-advanceable mortgage. I'll throw at one bank here, Scotia, not to advertise them by any means, but I happen to know they have something called a step mortgage, a Scotia Total Equity Program mortgage. And pretty much every major bank has some sort of similar product, but where it's a feature where, and sometimes you'll have to pay a little bit more for this kind of product, but it's a feature where you can have effectively multiple different mortgages under one mortgage. So it's not like you have a first and a second mortgage. You just have one first mortgage, but that's how it's registered legally. But at the bank level, they will say, okay, well, here's your, you know, $500,000 real mortgage, but your total lending ability is $800,000. So next year, when you go to buy a car, instead of getting a car loan, you can borrow $50,000, and it's on a totally separate term. So, you might want a 5 year or a 10-year amortization on it. And you might want a 2 year term on that. So different amortization, different term. And it's obviously also going to be at a different interest rate, whatever the current rates are at that time. But those kinds of products are wonderful if you're in a position where you want to be able to take advantage of opportunities as they arise, and you want to quickly be able to write a big check without having, in some cases, you do have to go back and requalify. In other cases, you don't. You can just write a check and it's done. So again, it depends. But that re-advanceable feature for me, it's been critical. It's been one I've relied on most of my life. It's made, if you're utilizing something called the Smith maneuver or cash damming to make your mortgage tax deductible, those are the kinds of products that you need to make that happen. But it is, these are all things you do want to give some thought to in advance, because some of them are worth a bit of money, some of them aren't.
Yeah. Well, especially in a rising market, right? With the
Oh, for
re-advanceable
sure.
portion, if you're requalifying and the home value has gone up and now your borrowing
Yeah.
limit has increased, and you're able to do that. And yeah, you're right. So I've been looking at these. Well, I think RBC, I think there's his home line. I think Manulife has Manulife One. So
Yeah.
yeah, to your point, mo many of the big banks have that kind of thing, if you ask for it. Um, the other thing I was going to mention too is obviously banks are one option for you to go get your mortgage at. There are other options as well. You can go to your credit union. Um, those are sometimes nice because the banks are typically regulated by the federal government. The credit union often, well, some of them are federal, some of them are provincial, and so they might be governed by different rules. If you're finding that you're going to the bank and you're not getting the terms that you want, or you're not getting qualified for as much as you think you should, you could talk to your credit union as well. You could use an online lender. We've got a provider for that. We've got mortgage brokers we work with as well. And so that's actually one thing that I would probably recommend most people do is find out what your local bank is offering or whoever you have a relationship with. Also go and talk to a mortgage broker. Uh, they're great. Yeah, especially if it's not super basic. So I mean, I have my income. I also have the corp alongside it. It's just a bit of a different situation. Some banks aren't really looking at my corporate profit. They're only looking at my income. That's making it a bit tricky for me to get qualified for the amount I want. I talked to a mortgage broker and she said, "Oh yeah, no problem. Many of the lenders we work with can deal with that." And it's looking like I'll probably go in that direction with a lender that she's chosen. Um,
Yeah,
eh,
I'd actually say it's more important to talk to a mortgage broker than to your own bank.
I'd
Sure,
agree.
by all
Yeah,
means, talk to your own bank, but absolutely for sure, talk to a mortgage broker because they're going to be able to go to a whole bunch of lenders, and also they can offer some advice. They can look at your situation a little more objectively and say, this is, what we think would be good for you.
yeah, yeah. And just to touch a bit more on how a bank determine, or well, I keep saying bank, how a mortgage lender determines both the rate you get and the amount that you're going to qualify for on the mortgage. They're going to look at all sorts of things. Primarily, actually, it's going to be typically your earned income for the past 2 years. So usually they're wanting to see your last 2 years notice of assessment, T4 slips, so on and so forth. If you're incorporated, also they're going to ask often for the corporate profit, basically, so your corporate tax statements as well. So they're going to look at your income. They're looking for stability. So oftentimes, sometimes they'll just take the average of the past 2 years. If there's a big jump, they're going to raise a question mark and ask what that's about. They're going to take a look at your credit score, although frankly, I think people stress about that a little bit too much. You kind of want to have some credit score. If you've never had any credit of any kind, that might be a bit of a problem. You'd like to have a good credit score. I mean, make your payments on time, but I don't think you need to stress out about absolutely maxing that out. Frankly, in my view, it's just something that is overemphasized sometimes, at least online and in the online spaces that I look
Well,
for.
the bank wants to lend you money. Face it,
Yeah,
right? Like
exactly. Yeah.
that's how they make money. They want to lend you money. So yeah, I mean, and they've got the security of the house in a particular situation and CMHC insurance as well. So yeah, as long as they prefer stability, but as long as you're making a decent income, yeah, your credit score is not going to
Yeah.
matter
Yeah,
that much.
well,
It's going to matter
and
some.
all of this is for a reason. I mean, they are trying to establish how credit risky you are.
Right.
right? And so, in the same way that in a few of our past episodes, we've talked about if you want higher returns, you have to take on higher risk. It's the same thing here from the bank's perspective. If they perceive you as higher risk, they're going to charge you a higher interest rate,
Right. Yeah.
right? So that's what's happening there. Other than that, you kind of want to do the math yourself on how much you can afford. I have heard the saying before that the lenders give you just enough rope to hang yourself with. And basically, they're qualifying you for way more than is actually affordable. I'm not too sure that I actually agree with that assessment. I think from my own experience, I'm a saver. I don't spend that much. I wish the bank would offer me more. Again, I have some additional complications where they're not taking into account all of my corporate income. But for me, I'm wishing that they would offer to lend me more money. I'm, you know,
Yeah,
it's
that's been my experience as well. It's true, I guess, if you're a big spender,
mhm.
they're going to let you borrow enough that you're going to have to cut back quite a bit. But if you're a saver, and maybe even just in the middle. The banks do a pretty good job of making sure that you're in a position where you may have to cut back, you may have to give up on cable or Netflix, but you'll be able to make the payment. Usually, I think their cap, unless they've changed it, but it's 40% of your after-tax income. They don't want you spending any more than that on debt.
Yeah, yeah. So this brings us on to the role of pre-approvals rather, for a mortgage. And this is where I personally bungled things up a little bit. Well, not on purpose. I think it's you start looking and you find a place way faster than you think. And so I had intended to, about 3 or 4 months from now, really make the move. And so I just reached out to a realtor friend of mine and said, hey, can we maybe start looking at some places? I had intended to, in the next week or two, get a pre-approval for myself. And the role of that is that typically the bank will do all of this work ahead of time, and they'll say, hey, you're pre-approved for this amount. They'll lock in a rate for 90 days or 120 days. And if you find a place in that meantime, then it's pretty easy to just do the work and apply it to the place that you found. And it's just a little bit of extra work for them to then apply it to that mortgage. Makes it nice and easy, makes it stress-free for you. So in my case, I had planned to do that, but I also started looking at places before I had actually done that. And the way it worked was I looked at a few places on Monday. I was making offers by Wednesday of the same week, and I had an approved offer subject to a few things on the Thursday. And so now all of a sudden I'm scrambling to get my ducks in a row, get that financing in place. Do as I say, not as I do,
Well,
young listener.
don't beat yourself up too much. I think that pre-approvals used to be a much better deal and a much more serious lock-in 10 years ago or maybe even 5 years ago. I've heard so many situations lately where um, uh, banks have pre-approved, but then after the fact, they've reneged or they've
Yes,
said,
yeah.
"Oh no, we need more proof on this or that," and so the pre-approval has been pretty loose. And also, I've heard, and this is not something I have anything to back up with, but it used to be 90 days, 120 days, even 180 days, what was possible or common. And from what I'm hearing, sometimes a lot of lenders are only going out 60 days or 90 days now. They've shortened that
Mm.
pre-approval period. Now, maybe that's come back. I don't know. It's been a little while since I talked to somebody about that, but they used to be more valuable, I guess is what I'm saying. So
Yeah.
don't beat yourself up too much.
Yeah,
It's
yeah, no, fair enough. Yeah, well, and I think the other angle from this too is that the longer that you have to work with these different lenders, the more time you have to renegotiate, right? And so
and the less
uh,
stress you're going to have.
and the less stress you're going to have.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So just a quick note on that too. I mean, we've got some partners that can help, whether you're wanting to do more the online route or chat with the mortgage broker or what have you. Feel free to reach out if you are financing either your first home or doing a refinancing. Let us know. We'd be able to help, or yeah, whatever. Now, other than that, we've touched on it a couple times, but obviously, mortgages aren't only for people just getting started and getting into their first homes. There are also some opportunities for people, even if they own their home outright, they may wish to take on a mortgage for certain purposes. Arnold, do you maybe want to touch on that, why a person might do such a thing?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So my perspective on this is getting a reverse mortgage or borrowing to fund your retirement should not be the first thing to do. And frankly, probably shouldn't be even the first thing that you plan to do. However, if you're in and it used to be, again, going back into history 10, 15 years ago, um, reverse mortgages were a crappy deal. They were just really um, usurious. Uh, that's changed. Actually, they're the interest rates on them are still a bit higher than a traditional mortgage, but they're much more reasonable. And there's a number of different lenders out there that do that kind of thing now. I've actually changed my financial planning perspective when I talk to people because um, what I've seen lately for the last 5 or 10 years is more and more people are downsizing. And so I have a tendency to plan for some measure of downsizing in my plans. Not a lot, but a little bit. And if you're in a position where you really want to stay in your home, but you want to retire and you're planning to downsize 3 years from now, why not fund that with a little bit of debt? There's nothing wrong with that. It's not the first place you should go, but there is nothing wrong with that, especially if it's sort of done um, thinking about it and planning on it. And so you're not putting yourself in a terrible situation, 3 years or 5 years down the road. So the simple route to go, if you've got one of these re-advanceable mortgages, or if you've already got a line of credit attached to your house, is to use your existing facility and you just borrow a little bit. Um, the um, I've seen lots of people. Well, I guess usually they're still working when they want to borrow a little bit to renovate a little bit because they want to stay in their house for longer. That's okay, nothing wrong with that. Um, the Bit of a risk when you have that kind of line of credit thing, because usually those are variable rates, and so if the rates spike up, it can be a problem. Also, one of the negatives, again, of this re-advanceable thing or a home equity line of credit is you've got this big line of credit. It can be tempting to borrow too much. So you do want to be a little bit careful about that. But again, a little bit of borrowing, there's nothing wrong with it. Another option are reverse mortgages. Like I said, there are lots more lenders now. So um, they're not as onerous as they used to be. It's great that you can access the cash without selling your home if you want to stay in your home, knowing that probably you're not going to stay in your home that whole time. At some point, you're going to sell it and you'll be able to pay that off. Um, the
Well, and,
con
and
of a
so what's
reverse
the difference between a reverse mortgage and a home equity line of credit?
home equity line of credit, you're going to have to pay the interest every month. Um, well, unless you have a special arrangement. I think Manulife One, and this is again where you'd want to get a mortgage broker involved, but I think Manulife One on their HELOC actually has a provision that you don't have to pay the principal or pay the interest. But typically on most home equity line of credits, you've got an interest payment that you have to make every month. Whereas with a reverse mortgage, um, you're paying you're owing more interest every year, and you're owing interest on the interest every year, but you don't actually have to pay it until you sell the house or die. And that actually brings up one thing that we didn't talk about, Ben. The one feature that we have here, and this is just a small tool that you can use sometimes. But if you're over the age of 55 and you don't need a lot of money, but you just need a little bit, one option that everybody in BC has is to not pay your property tax. And it's effectively you're borrowing against your house, right? You're not paying your tax, you're borrowing that money from the government. But interestingly, A, it's a very low interest rate, and B, it's simple interest, and that's something that most people miss is you don't ever pay interest on the interest. So if you have $5,000 in taxes and you choose to defer those 10 years from today, you're not paying interest on 5,000 plus a bunch of interest payments. You're still just paying that same simple interest of $150 or whatever it is every single year. Well, you're not
Hmm.
paying it. It's getting added onto what you owe, but it's not compounding. So
Yeah,
that
and then
that
it does get paid when you sell the house.
when you sell the house or when
Yeah,
you die. Yeah, that's right. So,
yeah.
and the other negative of that is you won't be able to go to a lender and borrow money while you're owing the government some. So there are some considerations there, but it's a little option that can make a difference for some people. Um, I know it is hard for seniors sometimes to think about doing anything with the house. They want to leave it to the kids. And that's great. I mean, by all means, do that. But hey, don't let it ruin your retirement. Don't let it ruin your life. You need cash to live. And sooner or later, the odds are, again, I've seen it time and time and time again. I've had maybe two clients live in their homes until very late, like in their 90s. And I've heard of one recently. I was talking to somebody, their mom was 100 and still living in her home. That's rare. Most of the time in the 80s, people are either downsizing or actually, I had one client, maybe she's listening in here. She sold her home and decided to rent downtown Vancouver. And I said, financially, that may not be as good a move because, you're better off financially owning the land. But there's nothing wrong with that because then you're freeing up all this cash flow and it's more flexible. She's loving it. She's loving it, right? So there's no shame in any of these options. It just depends on what's right for you. But again, the reverse mortgage or the home equity line of credit can be an option in those situations.
Yeah, well, and I just say too, like it's the same with any other debt in that you can use it responsibly or you can use it irresponsibly.
That's right. Yeah.
And more often than not, like usually we're encouraging people not to go into overwhelming amounts of debt. You kind of make a bit of an exception for the home, just because
Yeah.
everyone has to live somewhere.
Yeah.
And it's, from my perspective, better to go into debt to purchase an asset that, in all likelihood, will over time be an appreciating asset rather than to go into debt for something that's going to be a depreciating asset, meaning it loses value over time.
No,
Right. So,
absolutely, absolutely. And the other thing is actually it's tax-free growth, right? Like
yeah,
your
if it's your
principal
primary,
residence,
yeah.
yeah, for principal residence, it's tax-free growth. And along those lines, actually, one thing I would comment on, and maybe this is less about mortgages and more about buying the place, but um, understand that when you buy a place, you're buying two things. You're buying land underneath it, and you're buying a building. The building typically depreciates. The building doesn't go up in value. I mean, sometimes it does because of labor costs and the cost of wood, whatever. But typically, the building costs you money. It doesn't
Yeah.
make you money,
Well, and,
but
and
the
to
land
punctuate
does.
that point, the building I'm looking at that I'm hopefully closing on in less than a week, it's almost a 50-year-old building, and it's been reasonably well maintained, but at that age, you're starting to have lots of repairs coming up on the depreciation report, and it's looking like, in all likelihood, within the first 5 or 10 years, I'll probably be looking at a special assessment and have to come up with an additional
Right.
30, 40, 50 grand, who knows, to repair the building. So to your point, the the value there is in the land, not
That's right.
in the,
That's right. So
or at least the appreciating part.
there's this old saying, it's best to buy the worst house in the best neighborhood. Because
Right.
then you're getting more of what you're buying as land value because that's what's going to go
Yeah.
up in time.
Yeah. Yeah. So we've covered a fair bit here, but I wanted to kind of maybe rapid fire a little bit, clear up just a few common myths that you hear. Some of them we've touched on already, but we'll just kind of fly through them here. Um, so Arnold, the myth: you should always take the lowest rate. Getting the lowest rate is the most important thing and the best option for you. What do you have to say to that?
110% that's a myth. All my life, I have tended to go for or almost all my life, I shouldn't say that. The first mortgage I got, we focused on rate. But after that, I almost consistently probably paid about 1/10 of a percent more than I could have because I wanted that. Remember, I was talking about that re-advanceable feature. For me, that was really important, but that may not be the only one. These days, I said it before, the mortgage industry is the Wild West. If you go to the major banks, you're probably going to have a feature that you can pay off 10, 15, 20% of the mortgage at any point in time. And those features are all different depending on the bank you deal with. If you go to some of these other tiny lenders, which can be great, they can have better rates, they may not have that feature. So is that feature important to you? How important is it? It may be worth paying a little bit more to get that feature. The portability, if you sell your home and buy another one, do you want to be able to move your mortgage from the one place to another, or are you going to be forced to pay it out and face big penalties? There's just a whole bunch of different potential things that might be worth more than that lowest rate. So just keep that in mind and give that some thought when you're doing it. Um, Okay, Ben, myth to you. You can't negotiate with the mortgage lender.
Yeah, well, and so that we touched on already as well, is that you can and should negotiate to try to get a better rate for yourself. I think the key thing to remember here is that yes, the bank kind of wants to charge you more interest because they make more, but they're also competing for your business, right? And so for them to match and drop their interest rate from, let's say, 4% down to 3.9% to earn your business, yeah, they earn a tiny bit less, but they're still earning hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of interest over the lifetime of the loan that you're with them. So they are really competing for your business. You should be taking advantage of that and moving between different lenders to try to see, if you can get the best rate. Not just the best rate, but also just in terms of what kind of different structure you want, whether it's fixed or floating or the prepayment terms. That's one thing we haven't talked about is prepayments. There's, sometimes, actually, oftentimes, you can't just prepay your whole mortgage right up front if you want to. You are locked into a contract. I think most oftenly I've seen that you're allowed to prepay about 20% of the principal per year, but that varies drastically. As Arnold had mentioned before, like it's kind of the Wild West out there. There's no standard mortgage at the end of the
Oh,
day.
but you know what we didn't say, and I just assumed it, but so remember we were talking about the term. The bank doesn't necessarily, they're not legally required to renew at the end of that term. Well, at the end of that term, you also have the legal right, like technically you owe the whole thing. And so you have the legal right at the end of that term to pay as much as you want. So the bank may be letting you pay 20% a year, or maybe it's 10, or maybe it's
Yeah, during the
15
term, exactly.
during
Yeah.
the term, but at the end of the term, you can pay
Yeah.
whatever you
Yeah.
want.
No, good point. Okay, so Arnold, myth. Once my mortgage is in place, I'm totally safe for 25 or 30 years. I don't have to worry about a thing.
Yeah, well, if you miss a payment, you're going to have to worry about your thing. There's a few things. No, you're the once the mortgage is in place, you're going to have an amortization, and that doesn't protect you at all. That's just the estimate of how long it's going to take you to make the payment. Actually, I guess one thing we didn't talk about, and I should mention it as well, is typically the bank at the end of the year, or at the end of your term, what they will do, because most people want to slowly pay down their mortgage. If you had a 5-year term and you started off with a 25-year amortization, at the end of that 5-year term, they're going to renew you at a 20-year term because you've been paying for 5 years. Typically, they do that as a matter of course, but you actually have flexibility to adjust it. Um, but back to the myth. It's really the term that gives you the safety. And so you may get safety for 1 year if you have a 1-year term, or 2 years if you have a 2-year term, or five if you have a five, or again, there's the odd 7 or 10-year term as well. Um, During that time period, you're safe as long as you make your payments. But if you don't make your payments, um, banks will be fairly quick to um, take legal steps to get their payments because they just don't want to be in that position. They don't want to own the house any more than you want them to own it. They'll help you with it. Some banks have an option to skip a payment. That goes back to what we were talking about before. There are all these little features. Be aware of them. But no, you're not safe. Oh, and so last myth here, housing always goes up.
Well, it feels like for the last decade it kind of has. Not so much actually since 2022. Things have been coming back down. But, obviously, as with any market, there is risk involved. Your house might go down in value. Um, I do think too, it's kind of hard to tell. It's something that we call volatility smoothing, basically, is that because your house isn't bought and sold daily, you can't see the market fluctuation that would be happening if it was bought and sold daily. You only see every, let's say, 10 years when you sell it, and you've sold it for a different price, and oftentimes that's a little bit higher or a lot higher than what you bought it for. If this was a publicly traded market, you would see a lot of day-to-day volatility in the price, right? And so that's just a factor there. Obviously, there are times where housing can go down, even on that longer period, if a particular economy isn't doing so hot, if there are job losses. The housing sector also, as we know, is pretty tied to interest rates. So when interest rates went up so fast, people can't borrow as much, the interest rate is too high, and so now their purchasing power is diminished. The cost of that asset class goes down. So no, there is, risk in the housing market. Long term, yeah, I'd tend to think not so much housing, but the cost of land probably will continue to appreciate over a pretty long period. But we are talking quite a few years there that we're looking at.
Yeah, I'd agree. As long as we've got in-migration, we're going to have additional demand for housing, and it's in the absence of major interest rate swings, we're going to see land prices continue to rise bit by bit, but there's always going to be short periods of time when they don't. Sometimes, and fortunately, I didn't get stuck with this, but I knew people in the 80s when interest rates went from 4% to in the 20s. I mean, imagine owing $1 million at 4%, or what's the current rate on a 3 or 4 year term, Ben?
Yeah, 3.94,
Yeah, okay,
something like
okay.
that.
So you've got this interest payment of basically 40 grand a year. Imagine that going up fivefold. I knew people that lost their houses, right? Because they had a renewal that happened around that time. So that's again going back to that term. That's where that term is so important. If you have a 5 year term, you don't have to worry about it until the 5 year comes up. But if you've got a maturity at that time, now all of a sudden you're going to be forced to pay that higher payment. So you do need to really be aware of that.
Yeah, for sure. So I think that's, mostly doing it here, aside from a few just kind of wrap up things here. I would tend to say, as with everything more or less that we talk about, you don't need to be an expert in these things, but I do think it's important to know the basics, know what's going on, know some of that basic terminology, just so that when you are talking to that mortgage lender, you can ask appropriate questions, you can understand what they're saying. I think doing a little bit of research goes a long way to being able to get a good deal for you. Shop around, compare your options, use those professionals wisely. So I would, like we talked about, try to use a mortgage broker, even if it's just to compare and contrast what you would get elsewhere. You don't have to use them. And other than that, remember your home, it's a shelter primarily, and you may or may not think of it as a financial asset as an aside. But at the end of the day, I would tend to encourage you to think it primarily as the shelter. That's the primary reason. And then aside from that, may or may not appreciate in value. I'm taking that view myself. Like right now, I don't know where the housing market's going to go in the next 6 months. I think there are arguments to be had that it'll continue to decline. I also think there are arguments that maybe we do turn around and start to pick up again. At the end of the day, I don't care. I've found a place that is appropriate for me on my budget. I'm planning to live there for a long time. What happens to my, the number on my spreadsheet that says it's worth something, it's not really that vital. At the end of the day, if it goes up, then that's great. If it goes down, then maybe my next house is cheaper. I'm trying to think of it. Maybe that's a little bit of copium, but just, be happy with what you've got. And then other than that, yeah, just try to think about how a mortgage or home equity or lack of a mortgage might fit into your other retirement plans and what you've got going on there.
Yeah, I've got a few key takeaways, and I think some of them echo just exactly what Ben said. But don't be afraid of good debt, right? Like most of the time, borrowing to buy your principal residence is good debt. I mean, don't blow your brains out. Don't borrow way beyond your means, but don't be afraid of good debt ever. Get a pre-approval whenever you can. Because we said it before, if rates go down, you're going to end up getting that better rate. But if they go up, you'll get that pre-approved rate. Use a mortgage broker at the very least to get leverage with your existing bank, but probably you'll want to use their services. By the way, in Canada, mortgage brokers, we didn't talk about this. In Canada, mortgage brokers get paid by commission, so you're not paying extra out of pocket. The bank actually,
they're paid by the lender.
That's right, they're paid by the lender. And when you're thinking about terms, think of the higher rate that you pay on a longer term as an insurance premium, and decide on your term that way rather than thinking about randomly, do you think interest rates are going to go up or down? Trust me, the banks know a lot more about whether interest rates are going to go up or down than you do, and they've adjusted them accordingly. So forget about that. Think about your circumstances and what works for you. And then finally, what I said before, buy that worst house in the best neighborhood, get more land value, less building value. That gives you the biggest chance that your property value is going to rise more than the interest that you're paying.
Yeah. So thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of the Retire in BC podcast. Whether you're buying your first home, refinancing, or just looking at ways to unlock your home equity in retirement, remember that the best mortgage strategy isn't just about getting the lowest rate. It's about how it fits into your bigger financial picture. If you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe and share it with someone who might benefit. See you next time. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast may not necessarily reflect those of IPC Securities Corporation or IPC Investment Corporation. The information provided is for informational and entertainment purposes only and should not be construed as financial, legal, or tax advice. The hosts and creators of this podcast assume no liability for actions taken based on the content discussed.